My name is Robert Woody. I'm Associate Professor of Music Education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I'm going to be talking with you today about a topic in the category of music psychology, specifically the motivation behind practicing that a musician does. One thing, as the title of my topic would suggest, practicing is not typically something that people really like to do. Now, in case you're thinking, but I don't mind practicing, I love playing my instrument or I love singing, I need to define what I mean by practicing. Now, the way psychologists define practice, they call it deliberate practice. There are three key components of the definition. One is that it's an effortful activity. Two, it's done in isolation. And three, it's designed to specifically improve skills. So considering these three aspects of practice proper, it's no wonder that most musicians don't really enjoy it. It's hard work, it's lonely, and it's spent focusing on your deficiencies. So what's to like about that? So practicing is really not ever intrinsically motivating. Well, at least not usually. I hold out a little bit of hope that for some people it can become more than just a chore that they struggle through. But the solitude and concentration that is applied in practice is very key. So we know from the research that practicing is made more productive when a musician goes into it with some structure in mind, with some goals set, and their focus during their session is on the detection of their performance errors and having some strategies in place to correct those errors. So we know from the research also that the quality of practicing and the amount of practicing one does really does pay off. Research has firmly established that cumulated practice time is the best predictor of musical performance development. So I used the term intrinsically motivating before, so I think it's important that I am clear about what I mean by intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Now, obviously, the word intrinsic refers to something that comes from within, and extrinsic means coming from outside. But what's often misunderstood is within what and outside of what. It's a mistake to think that intrinsic motivation is that which comes from within yourself, and extrinsic motivation is coming from outside of yourself or coming from someone else. In fact, intrinsic motivation is the motivation or the reward that comes from the activity itself. So in our case, music. It's when you do music for the enjoyment or the reward of just doing music. Intrinsic motivation is also talked about in the terms of enjoyment or the emotional reward, the thrill of it, or even just the love of it. And there are some really key extrinsic sources of motivation in the lives of young musicians. Children gain a lot from the encouragement of parents and teachers and the reward systems that they set up for their students. Young people who persist in music, whether it's through school ensembles or garage bands, they often do so because of their peers. Perhaps it's membership in a musical subculture, or even the competition with some of those musical peers of theirs. Competition is, of course, a very powerful motivational factor for better or for worse. And people themselves can be their own source of extrinsic motivation too. They can decide that certain activities they're involved in are important, they want to feel good about themselves, and they maybe even have this need to achieve in whatever they're involved in. And so they are kind of motivating themselves, not because of the musical activity, but because of their belief that they need to be successful. So both sources of motivation are necessary for musicians. In fact, I'd suggest that the balance of both is critical for sustaining long-term growth and fulfillment in a musical life. Extrinsic motivators can be so present and so effective in the life of young musicians that they can become internalized. There is a theory called self-determination theory that has been advanced by two prominent motivation researchers, Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. And within this theory, there is a great way to explain how musicians come to accept the hard work that's part of practice. Now, in their self-determination theory, on one end of the spectrum is when somebody is completely unmotivated. They have no self-determination. And on the other end of the spectrum is when they are completely self-determined, or they are engaged in an activity purely for the rewards of that activity. If we zoom into the middle point here between having no self-determination and being completely self-determined by intrinsic interest, here we have extrinsic motivation. And they have defined 4 levels of extrinsic motivation, which go from completely extrinsic to becoming more internal to the individual. So here's how I apply the specific levels of extrinsic motivation to musicians and the practice that they do. The first level that they call external regulation, a musician might think, I have to practice. It's done out of compliance, it's done to obtain rewards, avoid a punishment maybe that a parent would offer for not practicing. So they feel like they have to do it, and they do it just because they're made to. The second level is called introjected regulation, and the musician might think, I ought to practice. So it's becoming a little more internalized. They do it so that they can feel good about themselves, to avoid the guilt feelings of not practicing, and so they think, I should do this. The next level is called identified regulation, where a musician thinks, I need to practice. They've gotten to the point where they value practice, they understand that there are benefits that come with it, and it's becoming personally important to them. And I would suggest that a lot of advanced high school musicians are approaching this level, and that a lot of music majors in college are also kind of in this place right now. The fourth and final stage of this progression is called integrated regulation. And it would be great if I could say that when you reach this point, you as a musician thinks, I want to practice, but that is not the case. Instead, the musician just thinks, I practice. So they have adopted practice as part of their daily routine, perhaps, and they do it because it's become assimilated into their identity. They no longer deliberate about whether they should practice or whether they need to practice. They just practice because it's part of what they do. So I found this great quote in a biography of the pianist Andre Watts. And to my surprise, as I read this, it really lays out this progression perfectly. So he says, I would not be a pianist today if my mother hadn't made me practice. So I would suggest this is the external regulation. He says, on days when I wasn't exactly moved to practice, my mother saw to it that I did. Sometimes she tried coaxing me to the piano by relating the careers of famous musicians, hoping perhaps to inspire me to practice. And I would say that's introjected regulation. At 13, however, I realized the necessity of practice. I'd say he's advanced to realize that at the age of 13, of course. And finally, he says, I still don't really like it at all, but by now it has become second nature to me. I love the term that is used here, second nature, because second nature refers to a behavior that has become so routine it seems instinctive. So there are many things about music making that are first nature, meaning they're inherently gratifying for human beings. But practicing is not one of them. But second nature, I think, is something that can be attained. So, is it possible for someone to actually enjoy practice? I would say that's highly uncommon, but I do think it is possible. If a person is so supremely confident about the process of practice, meaning they are convinced that it works, I think they can become very committed to refining the process of practice for themselves. They can begin to analyze themselves, how they respond to different practice routines and different strategies. They become really invested in seeking feedback from others around them, and they may actually begin to experiment with different things in their practicing life. They may even become really interested in psychology or how the mind works and how people learn. Another key here, I think, is that people start to boost the intrinsic motivation around their practice. So their practicing is still hard work, It's not fun, but they kind of build some fun things around it. So they do so by incorporating some personal choice and autonomy into what they do. So maybe identifying the things within their performance field that they really enjoy and focusing on that in their practice. And they also may use their advances in practice to promote the social aspects of music making. So being able to connect with people around their music activities. Ultimately, some people can come to almost make a game of practice. So they're creating challenges for themselves, testing out different approaches, developing systems, formulating principles about what works for them and what works about music learning altogether. So I would suggest that people can become part musician, part psychologist, even part detective, a practice detective, if you will. So in the best case scenario, musicians can become so engaged that they become fascinated with the phenomenon of practice itself. They may even begin to see themselves as a musical investigator of sorts. So the great performance that comes at the end of practice is not what it's all about. It can even become about the thrill of the hunt. So to conclude, I'd like to leave you with some questions that maybe challenge you to apply what I've shared with you today to what we do as musicians and what we do as music teachers. So I ask, what are some specific ways in which teachers can help young musicians acclimate to the expectations of practice and the approaches that make it effective? Also, what are likely outcomes for music students who never come to internalize the extrinsic motivators in their lives? And finally, how might music education practices in our schools change to better instill in students the sense of autonomy that they need to become independent music makers? So I would encourage you to think about these questions I've presented here, as well as how you might apply some of the other information I've shared with you in this presentation. I think it's important that we find ways to build more intrinsic motivation in the activities we do as musicians and as teachers. As you think about your future students that you'll have, I think we need to be careful that we don't just assume that they will take on the mindset that you have as music majors and as career musicians, but we need to work to help instill in them ways to make music personally relevant to them so that they will take the steps necessary to have musical success in their lives. Thank you for your attention,